Thanks everybody for joining us and welcome to this webinar on public threats in the time of COVID-19. Before we begin the webinar, we'd just like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land and pay our respects to elders past and present, and also extend that respect to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people listening today. All right, so my name's Tom McKeith. I work in the CLE team at Legal Aid, and I'm joined by my colleague Bridget Barker, who is a civil lawyer and has worked in the CLE team with me on this project. And also Natalie Newman, who's part of the CLE team and is helping us out today. So, hi guys.
Hi everyone.
Okay, so just a quick disclaimer about the information today. We're just providing some legal information today. It's not legal advice, but we're going to provide information about how to get legal advice should anybody need it. So there'll be information about that later on. Okay, so first thing, the purpose of today's webinar is to help you better understand these new laws in New South Wales around public threats and incitement to violence. And the new section of the Crimes Act is section 93Z, which is why we're asking that poll question. So I want you to know about those new laws, what to do if you are a victim of an incident or witness an incident, or someone you're working with is a victim of one of these incidents. And also we're going to talk a little bit about other protections like anti-discrimination legislation, anti-vilification legislation, and other protections that are available as well. So you kind of have a broad sense of the protections that are available to you or people you work with if you're the victim of racial, homophobic, or other kinds of public threats. So I'm going to talk a little bit about section 93Z, and then I'm going to hand it over to Bridget to talk about discrimination and vilification. Then I'm going to wrap things up by talking about a few other criminal law things, and we're going to take some additional questions at the end if we have some time. So that's kind of the plan. A bit of context for this whole thing. Bridget and I have been working on a project for the last 6 months or so to raise some awareness about this section 93Z of the Crimes Act. And we've been working with the Office of Community Safety and Cohesion on that. So this webinar is a part of that project. And the reason we think it's really important is because this is a really valuable bit of legislation, and it's not something that everyone knows about at present. So as part of that project, we've put together a bunch of really good resources, and we've built a website where you can access those resources. So we're going to touch on that well throughout the webinar, but at the end as well, and you'll be receiving an email that has information about the website and a bunch of other materials. Okay, so I guess a question here is why was this new legislation passed? What's it all about? Why do we need it? So I thought it'd be useful to provide some background about how this started. So back in 2016, there was a series of quite serious race-related incidents that occurred in New South Wales and also in other parts of Australia. So you can see the headline I've grabbed there was actually from the ACT, but in particular, there was a white nationalist group called the Anti-Discrimination Resistance, and they put up stickers and posters in public places, universities in particular, calling for the death of particular racial groups. So understandably, it caused a lot of issues, but surprisingly, there wasn't an effective piece of legislation for prosecuting the people responsible for this. There was existing anti-vilification legislation in the Anti-Discrimination Act, but there hadn't been any prosecutions made under that legislation for 30 years. And it wasn't suitable for dealing with these incidents that had come up. So it seemed like there was a real issue there that needed some attention. So I think, what happened next was a really great story of what can be achieved through some really effective grassroots advocacy and community groups coming together. And I think it's a really great reminder of what can be done. So community groups led by this Keep New South Wales Safe Coalition advocated for changes to the legislation. And it was a massive effort over several years. Some of you listening today might have been involved in it or might know people who were. But they had over 150 meetings. There was a media campaign, many community organisations were involved, and it was there was bipartisan support for the bill that was eventually introduced into Parliament. And in August 2018, the Crimes Amendment Publicly Threatening and Inciting Violence Act came into force. So that's some background into why we have these new Section 93, this new Section 93Z, and gives some indication of what it's intending to focus on. So what is this new bit of legislation? How does it work? How is it going to be of benefit to you guys as community workers? Well, it's replaced the previous legislation that was in the New South Wales Anti-Discrimination Act. And it says that if someone intentionally or recklessly threatens or incites violence towards another person or group of persons by a public act on the grounds of race, religion, sexual orientation, gender identity, intersex or HIV status, they're guilty of the offence. So obviously that's a bit of a mouthful, and we'll unpack what all those things mean. That's what the legislation says, and there's a maximum 3-year imprisonment if someone's guilty of an offence under Section 93Z. So let's break that down and kind of go through what the different parts of it mean. So the legislation says that it covers public acts. So what do we mean by a public act? Well, it can be any form of communication to the public. So as we put up on the slide here, it can be speaking, writing, broadcasting, displaying notices, social media, really anything else you can kind of think of that is a communication to the public. I think a really important one to be aware of is that it does cover social media and stuff that's online as well, if that's public. And also it can cover public acts that are done on private land as well. So just because something's done on private property doesn't mean that it can't also be a public act. So covers a wide range of things, but of course it won't cover something like 2 people talking in private at home. Okay, and as mentioned, it repeals the previous serious vilification offences in the Anti-Discrimination Act. It also says that the Act, recklessness is sufficient to establish intent for the Act, for an offence. So that's an important distinction. And also a few other changes. As opposed to the previous offences, it's removed the previous short time periods for commencing prosecutions. So previously, if there was an incident, it had to be prosecuted very quickly after the incident took place. Now there are longer time periods. The police are now responsible for prosecuting this offence, which is a change. And there's this higher penalty of 3 years imprisonment. In addition, the range of groups protected has been increased. Previously, the legislation only covered race and HIV/AIDS status. So it's really great that it's now protection available to a wider group of people. So we don't have any case law yet on this legislation. There haven't been any prosecutions yet under Section 93Z, and we can certainly talk a little bit more about what that might mean and the implications of that down the track. But we have been given some guidance by the police in terms of the kinds of matters that they think will be covered by Section 93Z. And as a result of that, we've put together a little example video that we were going to play for you to show an example of what we think might be covered and the kind of things that you guys could look out for. We've been careful to include as few specifics as possible because we don't want to be rebroadcasting any threats or incitements to violence, but we need enough detail so that it makes sense. So I just wanted to give everyone a quick warning about the video. But But yeah, have a watch. We'll see. Hopefully we get the tech to work, and it should give you an example of the kind of thing that might be covered by 93Z.
Thanks, Tom. It's Natalie here. I'm just going to play the video. You may need to press a button, like a blue button perhaps, to play the sound. So if it's not working on your device, maybe just look for a button. All right, here we go.
I was on Facebook and I saw that the page for my local mosque, someone had posted a comment for everyone to see. Whoever posted it called us terrible names, said they were going to get Muslims like us. They put a bunch of skull and crossbone emojis at the end of the post. When I saw what they'd written, I was concerned about my safety and the safety of everyone who worships at the mosque.
Okay, well, I hope that played okay for everybody. Mine was a bit glitchy, but hopefully everyone kind of understood what was going on there. Sing out if it didn't make sense. Basically, there was a post on the Facebook page for Omar's Mosque saying that someone would get the Muslims and people like him, and they put skull and crossbone emojis on the post. So this kind of act would be covered by 93Z because the post was a threat. So 93Z covers threats or incitements to violence because the poster said they'd get Muslims and used a skull and crossbones emoji. It was public because he made it on a public Facebook page, and it was on the basis of Omar's religious affiliation as a Muslim. So this is the kind of thing that we're thinking Section 93Z, the new piece of legislation, will cover. Okay, so that's some explanation of Section 93Z. I just wanted to touch on what the implications might be in this time of COVID-19. So I think there's certainly been a spike in racist attacks as a result of COVID-19. It's been reported in the media, and we've heard from a few of our other stakeholders that this has been the case. And in particular, there's been an increase in attacks on Australians of Asian descent. So I think really this means that more than ever, knowing about this legislation is more important than ever. And if someone is the victim of a racist attack, then we want them to know that Section 93Z might be there as a protection for them. And even if the attack wasn't a physical attack, there might be something that they can do about it. And of course, not every incident will fall under this legislation, but it is an important protection that's available. So, you know, we think really at this time, it's even more important for people to be aware of the legal protections that are available. So, having said all that stuff, what can you guys do as community workers or people who are interested in this area? Well, a really first important thing to be aware of is that anyone can report an incident under Section 93Z, not just a victim or a member of the group that's targeted. So this puts community workers in a really important position, I feel. Not only can they educate the people they work with about the legislation, but they can also report incidents themselves. So, you know, this gives community workers a great deal of responsibility. So if you report an incident to the police, they'll ask who's responsible for it. So if you have information about who's responsible for these kind of incidents, make sure you record that and take that down. And I probably should have said this first, but the people to report an incident to is the police. You should call 000 if an incident is happening at the time, or you can call the police assistance line if you're making a report at another time. And the other thing that is really important is that this is a difficult area, as you guys have probably seen from the legislation. It can be kind of complicated, and Section 93Z might apply or might not apply, or there might be other laws that might apply. So working out which one is relevant can be really difficult, and it can be really useful to get legal help about that. So legal aid is here in order to provide that, and you can phone us on 1300 888 529 in order to get legal advice. So we urge anyone to do that if you need some more information. Okay, so that's 93Z. I now want to pass it over to Bridget to talk about discrimination and vilification and the protections that are available there. So over to you, Bridget.
Thanks, Tom, and thanks everybody for joining us today. Just before I get started talking in more detail about discrimination law and the laws that deal with vilification, I just wanted to say to everybody, it's quite a complicated and technical area of law. The purpose of this webinar and the information that I'm providing isn't so that you can action things yourself necessarily under the law, or there's no expectation that you will be able to absorb everything. But I just wanted to give a broad understanding of how discrimination and vilification laws work. As well as that, as an outcome of today's webinar, we would hope that you will be better informed about where you can go to access resources to get more information, and where you can go to access help if you or someone you are working with or someone you know experiences an offence under Section 93Z or discrimination or vilification. Also, just a reminder to please type in any questions that you might have about anything that I'm saying, and if I don't get a chance to respond to them during this section, Tom and I will, there's time at the end of the webinar for us to answer as many questions as we can. Okay, so in Australia, there are a lot of laws which cover discrimination, and there's a list of them on the slide that's on your screens now. And what partly makes this area complex is that it's a result of us living in a Commonwealth or being part of a federation, is that there are both Commonwealth laws and state New South Wales laws that cover this area, and that complicates things somewhat, because at times you have to go to either the Commonwealth body that deals with complaints about discrimination and vilification, or you may need to go to the state body, Anti-Discrimination New South Wales, depending on the circumstances. So please don't think that you need to remember any of this detail, but just to let you know that it's complex, and these are some of the reasons for it being complex. So Tom's gone through Section 93Z, and it's quite specific in that it's incitement or threats of violence against a person or group of people on those particular grounds. But there are situations where you may experience what is unfair treatment, and other laws will apply in those situations. So sometimes, not always, but sometimes when you're treated unfairly, it is against the law. Discrimination happens when someone is treated unfairly because they belong to a particular group of people, or because they have a particular characteristic. And that's what is called a ground of discrimination. In New South Wales, the main act that applies is the Anti-Discrimination Act. And there is also a Commonwealth Act that covers some parts of discrimination that occur, which is the Sex Discrimination Act. In addition to discrimination having to happen because of a characteristic of the person, which is the ground, discrimination also has to happen in certain areas of life because the law covers particular areas of life, and I'm going to go into that a bit further and explain it a bit more in the next couple of slides.
Bridget, I just note there's a little question there about, but it's also the case for Section 93Z that, and presumably this is that there has to be an area and a ground for something to come under Section 93Z. And I'll just say, as long as the incident is in the public and that it's as a result of that list of it's a threat or incitement to violence based on one of those grounds at the top or due to membership of one of those groups, and they are, I'll just read them out again. Has to be as a result of race, religion, sexual orientation, gender identity, or intersex or HIV/AIDS status, then it can come under Section 93Z. So I'll pass it back to you, Bridget.
Oh, great. Thanks, Tom. Yeah, so as you can see, it is confusing because we now have a criminal section in the Crimes Act that deals with certain acts that might occur. And then we also have what has always been available is the laws against discrimination and vilification. So it is quite complicated, and that was a good question because there is some distinction between the Crimes Act and how that section deals with threats and incitement to violence, and the way that the Anti-Discrimination Act works in relation to discrimination. So let's go to the grounds of discrimination now so that you might start to get a feel for it. Discrimination, for it to be unlawful discrimination, it has to firstly happen because of these particular characteristics. It has to be discrimination that occurs because of your race, your sex, your sexual orientation, your gender identity, your age, your marital or domestic status, because you're pregnant or breastfeeding, because you're homosexual, transgender, or have transsexual status, because you have an infectious disease, or because you are somebody living with a disability, or someone who has carers or family responsibilities. On top of all of those grounds, if you associate with someone who has one of those characteristics and you experience discrimination, then you can also complain about that discrimination, subject to it also happening in particular areas of life, which I'll talk about in the next slide. Just a little...
I was just going to say there's another question here, which is sex and sexuality the same thing under the law?
No, I don't believe that it is. So sex is whether you're, if you identify as female or male, so that might be a situation where you feel that you're treated differently to someone who is male if you're female. And sexuality, my understanding of sexuality is more your sexual orientation. But if anyone out listening to the webinar wants to correct me on that, please feel free to. And I should just add a little disclaimer. I am a civil lawyer, so I practice in a broad range of areas of civil law, and I don't profess to be an expert in this area of law. So if there's something that I need to correct, or I will get back to you on that.
I'd also say in relation to 93Z, it distinguishes between sexual orientation as one of the grounds, and gender identity. So it uses that word, gender identity, for sex, and sexual orientation for sexuality. So 93Z does draw that distinction.
Okay, thanks, Tom. And just a note too that, as I said, there's sometimes the Commonwealth law might cover an act of discrimination, and sometimes the state law does. In relation to sexual orientation and gender identity, particularly, those unlawful acts of discrimination are covered by the Commonwealth Sex Discrimination Act. So you would, if you wanted to make a complaint or inquire about what your rights are, if that happens to you, then you would, in that instance, complain to the Australian Human Rights Commission. Okay, so now I'll move on to the areas of life that you need to be experience discrimination in order for it to be unlawful discrimination. So the areas of life are listed here in the slide. Discrimination on the grounds that I've just gone through has to happen in your employment, in education, in relation to land, in relation to dealings to do with land, or clubs and associations, accommodation, accessing goods and services, in relation to the administration of Commonwealth laws and programs, also in relation to public places and facilities or sport. So as an example, if you experience in your work or study that you are being treated differently because you belong to a particular race, so you're being treated differently to people of other races or ethnic origin, then it may be unlawful discrimination that you're experiencing. So just the main message that we would like you to get here is that it has to be a characteristic that's listed in the legislation, and it has to happen in particular areas of life.
Bridget, I'll just, I had a little note here that Anti-Discrimination New South Wales accepts complaints of sexual harassment as well as sex discrimination and sexual orientation, homosexuality discrimination, so they can also receive these inquiries as well as the Australian Human Rights Commission.
Oh, okay, yeah, thank you. Thank you for the person that contributed that, or if that was you, Tom. Oh, okay.
Anti-Discrimination New South Wales, so thanks, Jackie.
Thanks, Jackie. I do have that more specific information in a further slide, and thank you for correcting me right away so that people will get a better understanding. In addition to discrimination having to occur on particular grounds and in particular areas of life, discrimination can also be direct or indirect. Direct discrimination is discrimination that happens to an individual directly. So you experience discrimination because of your sex, and the act of discrimination occurs directly to you, but it can also happen in a way that is where discrimination isn't directed particularly at you. It's where there's a requirement that you need to follow, or a rule that is the same for everybody, but in the way it operates, it does disadvantage certain people from a particular group more than people from other groups. And it also has to be unreasonable, the requirement. An example to explain this is that a qualifying body excludes everybody who has diabetes on safety grounds. This would be an unfair rule or requirement if someone who has diabetes has it under control and their diabetes would not prevent them doing a particular job safely. So that's an example of indirect discrimination. Another example is where airlines impose an age limit for their staff because there's a perception that older people would not be able to manage the duties, or because it did not fit their image. That could be another example of indirect discrimination. So just to sort of sum up on discrimination, if treatment that you experience is unfair, it may not necessarily be unlawful discrimination. So an example of where it would not be unlawful is where you are unsuccessful in getting a job because you don't meet all the requirements for the job, such as you need a driver's license to do a particular job. If you don't have a driver's license, then you wouldn't qualify for that job. So that might feel like it's unfair, but it's not actually unlawful discrimination. Another example is, sorry, Tom?
Sorry, Bridget, I was just gonna say I had a couple of comments coming in. One of them from one of the watchers who felt like those examples could be really examples of direct discrimination as well. So I guess there's a bit of a fine line there between direct and indirect, but they're both covered. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah.
And then
perhaps,
sorry, I was just going to say the second question. Someone had a query about whether being bisexual was covered in this kind of discrimination legislation. And I'll just say quickly on 93Z that talks about sexual orientation. So I think that would cover bisexuality. I'm not sure about discrimination.
well, I think it would be because your sexual orientation is covered by discrimination law. So I would say yes in answer to that. Anything else?
The question would be whether the legislation refers to homosexuality specifically or not.
So there is homosexuality, but there is also your sexual orientation. Yeah, and I think that if people have, it sounds like they're quite specific questions, and if they have experienced discrimination on those grounds, then my suggestion would be that you make an inquiry with Anti-Discrimination New South Wales or the Australian Human Rights Commission, or make an appointment with legal aid to get some advice about the specific circumstances.
Absolutely.
Okay, so that's my very broad summary of discrimination law, and I'm just going to speak briefly now about vilification. So vilification is, I think a lot of people probably have a broad understanding of what vilification means, but there's a lot of other names for it. Under New South Wales law, under the Anti-Discrimination Act, the meaning of vilification is a public act that incites hatred, serious contempt, or severe ridicule towards people because of their race, homosexuality, HIV/AIDS or AIDS status, or transgender status. Vilification can also happen because someone is thought to be of a particular race, or thought to be homosexual, that is lesbian or gay, or thought to have HIV or AIDS status, or have transgender status. I'm going to talk about what a public act is under the Anti-Discrimination Act, because Tom already spoke to you about Section 93Z and what it means for something to happen in public. And public acts are described in the Anti-Discrimination Act as communications that can be seen or heard by the public, and that includes print, radio, video, or online communications. Also, signs, flags, or clothing that can be seen by the public, and distributing and sharing information publicly. So that's how public acts are described in this legislation. So in order to work out whether what has happened is vilification, there are sort of three main things that you need to think about. Only public acts are covered, so you need to ask, could someone who wasn't directly involved be capable of seeing, hearing, or reading what happened? And if the answer to that is yes, then you've ticked that first box. Then the next question is, was it serious enough to have incited hatred, serious contempt, or severe ridicule? Would other people be affected by it? That's a way to work out the level of seriousness. And then, was it legal because it was an acceptable type of free speech? So examples of that, to help you understand, are privileged statements that are made in Parliament. I think we've probably all heard things that politicians have said in Parliament, and they can't be prosecuted for those statements. Also, a fair report by the media about someone else's act of vilification, that would be considered to be acceptable free speech. And then another example is acts done reasonably and in good faith for academic, artistic, or scientific research purposes in the public interest. So, vilification under the New South Wales Anti-Discrimination Act, that's how that is defined. Then, who do I complain to? Trying to work out who you should go to can be complicated. So, if you experience discrimination on the grounds of disability, sex, race, or age, you can complain to the Australian Human Rights Commission. If you experience discrimination, and some of these do overlap, because of your disability, your sex, and that includes pregnancy and breastfeeding, because of your race, your age, marital or domestic status, your homosexuality, transgender status, or your carer's responsibilities, if that occurs at work, then you can complain to Anti-Discrimination New South Wales. And this slide, which you will be receive as part of the PowerPoint, has information on the numbers for those two bodies and their websites. And both of them have the ability for you to just make an inquiry without having to make a formal complaint. And also, of course, we would all encourage you to contact legal aid to get some advice if you think that you've experienced discrimination or vilification. So now I'll hand you back to Tom, who's going to speak now a bit more about the criminal law. Thanks, Tom.
Thanks, Bridget. And I know that a few other questions came in during that, so we'll try and pick those up at the end. So yeah, I just wanted to, as a final thing, touch on some kind of other aspects of the criminal law and how that relates to the Section 93Z that I was talking about at the top. In particular, I wanted to kind of discuss this really horrific incident that happened in Parramatta at the end of last year. An Islamic woman was physically assaulted in Parramatta in a cafe, and the attack was racially motivated. And at the time, there were calls to charge the offender under Section 93Z. We were working on this project at the time, and there was a fair bit of discussion around that, and we asked the police about this. And I think it's fair to say that aspects of the incident would fall under Section 93Z. However, with something like this, where the incident involved, racist statements and threats, but was also a physical assault, the police are more likely to charge the matter as a physical assault, and that's in part because assaults have a higher maximum penalty, 7 years, rather than 3-year maximum penalty for Section 93Z. So the police are more likely to charge an incident like this as an assault, and then the comments that were made and the racist motivation would be taken into account on sentencing as potentially as an aggravating factor. So that's why an incident like this that really looks like it would fall under Section 93Z might not be prosecuted by the police under that, but instead would be just dealt with as an assault. So yeah, that was just a bit of kind of clarification I wanted to provide about that. And just to kind of wrap up before we look at taking some questions, I just wanted to leave everybody with 3 things to take with you. So we think that the 3 things are that, the Section 93Z provides protection against public threats and incitements to violence, and anyone can report an incident, not just a victim. Second thing, we have a website with lots of resources, and we've got fact sheets in a range of community languages and posters and awesome stuff that we'd love you guys to use to spread information about this legislation and where people can get assistance. And the third thing is that if you want to report an incident, you can call the police on 000 or call the police assistance line on 131 444. And also, as I think is clear from this presentation, Section 93Z, but also discrimination and vilification are complicated areas, and it's often worth speaking to someone at Legal Aid or Anti-Discrimination New South Wales about a particular incident to get some more legal advice and to help you kind of navigate those complexities. So that's the third thing we'd like to leave you with, and there's going to be more information about that in the email that we're going to send out afterwards. So I think that's everything that we really wanted to cover. Anything further from you, Bridget?
Sorry, Tom, I got caught out having my microphone muted.
That's all good.
There's nothing further I wanted to add, just to encourage people to access the website, because there's a lot of great resources on the website, and to speak with Anti-Discrimination New South Wales, who have expertise obviously in the area of discrimination and vilification law, and to seek advice if if you speak with that body and you think you would like to make a complaint, you can always get advice from Legal Aid as well about your situation. And it's often easier to help people when you have a specific situation that they've experienced, rather than just speaking in general terms about the legislation.
Fantastic. Well, I'll just pick up on a couple of the questions that came through. One of them came up, I think, when we were going through the discrimination section, and it was whether religion is one of the presumably grounds upon which one can be discriminated against. I'll just say for Section 93Z, it is one of the grounds, I guess, for Section 93Z. And I know it's complicated in relation to discrimination, but Bridget, do you have thoughts on that?
To my knowledge, it isn't covered in the discrimination legislation. Jackie Line might like to correct me on that, but
Jackie from Anti-Discrimination New South Wales is on the line. Yeah, but I'll just yes, 93Z does include religion. So if someone was to make a threat or incite violence against a group of people, a group of Muslims or Christians or Sikhs or whatever it might be, that would be covered by 93Z. And then we've got a note here from someone, maybe Jackie, saying religion is not included specifically in the Anti-Discrimination Act. But just to clarify further, ethno-religion falls within the definition, so there might be some grey areas there. Oh, and that's from Julia, actually.
Thank you, everybody.
And then the other bit of clarification, I think, was just around that bisexuality question. And Julie told us as well that bisexuality is covered in, not covered in the New South Wales discrimination, but is covered in the Commonwealth legislation. Hopefully I've got that right there. So as you can tell as well, Anti-Discrimination New South Wales provide a fantastic service as well, and they're a great place to go to get more information and to get some assistance. Okay, so I'll just hold to see if anyone else has any other questions. And also, you don't need a named victim for Section 93Z. This is just responding to another question that came in. It's just it can be just against a group. So if someone was to say, you know, I think all whatever group should die or should be killed, or something like that. They don't have to name specific people. It can just be referring to a particular group. Just checking here. Okay, well, I think they're all the questions so far that have come in. So I just want to thank everyone again. And if you do have any other questions that have come up as a consequence of the webinar, please let us know. There's the email address there on the screen, so please feel free to take that down and get in touch with us. Otherwise, thank you so much, everybody, for getting involved and being here. And we really hope that you can help to educate your communities about Section 93Z and the other protections that are available to everybody. So thank you, Bridget. Thank you, Nat. Also, thank you to the other people from Anti-Discrimination New South Wales who are on the line who gave us a hand as well. So thank you very much, everybody.